So there's a new escalation in Asia today, and it didn't break the way you might think. China just dropped a blacklist on 20 Japanese defense firms, and they named names. But the real reason they did it, that's not what they're saying publicly. Quick thing before we get into it, drop the country you're watching from in the comments so I know where everyone's tuning in today. I actually read them. Let's get into what actually happened. So let me take you back to about 9 o'clock this morning, Beijing time. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce put out a statement, and if you just skim the headlines, you'd think it was routine. Another set of export controls, another list of companies. But the details here, they're not routine at all. 20 Japanese entities got added to the blacklist. That means they can't buy certain sensitive technologies from China anymore. No dual-use goods. Nothing that could have military applications. And then there's a separate watch list, another 20 entities that aren't fully banned yet, but they're being watched closely. Now, the list includes some serious players. The National Institute for Defense Studies. That's Japan's top military research outfit. Think of it as their Pentagon think tank. And then you've got subsidiaries tied to Mitsubishi Electric, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki Heavy Industries. These aren't random small businesses. These are the heavy hitters of Japanese defense manufacturing. China's official reason? They're saying it's about national security and non-proliferation. They're saying they're just fulfilling their international obligations. And here's where I gotta pause. Because if you believe that's the whole explanation, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. This isn't about non-proliferation. This is about Tokyo. Let me explain what's actually happening under the surface. For the last 6 months, the relationship between Beijing and Tokyo has been deteriorating at a speed that's actually kind of alarming. And the catalyst? Taiwan. Prime Minister Takaichi, she took office last year, and she's been bolder on Taiwan than any Japanese leader in decades. She's been making statements that China considers, and I'm quoting here, inflammatory and unacceptable. She's talked about Taiwan's security being vital to Japan's security. She's hinted at deeper military cooperation with Taipei. Now for China, that's a red line painted in fire. And here's what I think most Americans don't fully grasp. When Japan talks about Taiwan being important to them, it's not just geopolitical posturing. Japan's shipping routes go right past Taiwan, and they're completely dependent on those routes for energy imports. So when China threatens Taiwan, Japan feels it in their gut. That's the context here. But Beijing sees it differently. They see Japan, which, let's not forget, colonized Taiwan for 50 years, trying to meddle in what China considers an internal matter. And Takaichi's administration has been pushing the envelope further than previous Japanese governments. She's been more explicit, more forceful. And now we've got this blacklist. Here's the part that honestly makes me a little frustrated. The Western media, they're mostly covering this as a trade dispute, a tit for tat, a supply chain disruption story. But that's like saying the Titanic hit an iceberg and there was a small plumbing issue on board. This is not about trade. This is about deterrence. China is sending a message, and the message is, if you keep making noise about Taiwan, we will make your defense sector bleed. We'll go after your most advanced research institutes. We'll make it harder for you to develop the next generation of weapons. We'll remind you that you still rely on us for certain raw materials and components. And they're doing it in a way that's calibrated, surgical. They're not banning everything. They're hitting specific nodes in Japan's defense industrial base. Think of it like a chess move. One piece taken off the board, not the whole board. But here's what nobody's talking about. And I mean nobody. The watch list. The 20 additional entities that aren't blacklisted yet. Because that's where the real leverage lives. China is basically saying, we could expand this at any time. We could add your biggest suppliers. We could kill entire production lines. We haven't yet, but we've got the list ready. That's psychological warfare, that's intimidation, and it's pretty damn smart, honestly. So let's go back to Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies. This isn't just some academic office. This is where Japan models scenarios, war games. They look at potential conflicts in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, around Taiwan. They build simulations of what happens if China makes a move. Now imagine you're the director of that institute. You wake up this morning and your government tells you that China has cut off your access to certain Chinese components. Maybe it's rare earth materials. Maybe it's specialized electronics. Maybe it's something even more specific. And here's the thing, I've been digging into the actual lists. And the technology categories they've restricted, they're very precise. They're not going after everyday parts. They're going after the stuff you'd use in advanced radar systems, in guidance systems, in the kinds of tech that make a modern military modern. The Mitsubishi subsidiaries on this list, they're involved in aviation, in maritime systems, in the kind of equipment that Japan needs to protect its shipping lanes. And suddenly those systems are a little harder to build, a little more expensive, a little less reliable. This is what economic statecraft looks like in 2026. And I think Beijing is testing a theory here. The theory is that Japan's economy is more vulnerable to pressure than the US is, that Japan doesn't have the domestic production capacity to replace certain Chinese inputs quickly, that Takaichi's government, bold as it's been on Taiwan, is also politically fragile, that if they can raise costs enough, create enough friction inside Japan's defense industry, they might force Tokyo to moderate its position. That's the bet. Now, let me take you inside the Japanese reaction, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Japanese government hasn't gone nuclear publicly. They've issued a measured statement. They've said they're reviewing the details. They've talked about appropriate responses. But back channel, I'm hearing that they're furious. And I'm also hearing that they're genuinely worried because they know what China is capable of. This isn't 2010 when a fishing boat collision in the Senkaku Islands sparked a diplomatic spat that fizzled out. The environment is different now. The global order is more fractured. the U.S. is distracted, and you can't ignore that. With the election cycle heating up in America, with the House and Senate, with the whole Washington machine grinding, is anybody paying close attention to a blacklist from Beijing? Probably not as much as they should be. And that's exactly what China is counting on. You know what frustrates me about how this is being covered? Everyone's focused on the numbers. 20 companies blacklisted, 20 more watched. But nobody's talking about the precedent. Nobody's saying, wait a minute, if China can do this to Japan over a statement about Taiwan, what stops them from doing it to anyone else who criticizes them? Because that's the real headline. This is China saying, we will weaponize our economic leverage to enforce our geopolitical demands. We will not debate you. We will not persuade you. We will make it painful for you to disagree with us. Now ask yourself, does that sound like a country that's interested in peaceful coexistence? Look, I'm not naive. Every major power plays hardball. But there's a difference between hardball and this. And Takaichi's government, they have to respond. They can't just absorb this and move on. If they do, it signals weakness. It signals that China can push them around and they'll just take it. But what can they actually do? They could impose their own restrictions on Chinese tech. But that would hurt Japanese companies too. They could try to accelerate their domestic production of the goods China just cut off. But that takes years. They could call for closer military coordination with the United States, and they've already been doing that. But here's where it gets tricky. The U.S. is the United States going to guarantee Japan's supply chains? Are they going to divert their own military resources to make up for the Chinese components Japan just lost? Probably not. So Japan is in a bind. They're being squeezed by China, and they can't count on Washington to ride to the rescue with a fully stocked warehouse of replacement parts. This is the new normal, folks. Welcome to it. I want to slow down for a minute and talk about Prime Minister Takaichi specifically, because her personal position matters here. She's a nationalist. She's not hiding that. She's close to the old Abe faction in Japanese politics. She's talked about revising Japan's pacifist constitution. She's pushed for a more assertive military posture. And she's made Taiwan a central piece of her foreign policy, more central than her predecessors. And this is where I start to wonder, did China wait for Takaichi's administration to get fully settled before pulling this trigger? Or did they pull it now, early, to try to knock her off balance before she gets too entrenched? Because that's a real possibility. They might be trying to force her to back down on Taiwan early, to box her in, to make her look weak if she doesn't respond strongly, and reckless if she does. It's a no-win scenario for Tokyo. Let me take you back to the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing for a second. The language in their announcement is very careful. They talk about national security. They talk about international obligations. They use the phrase conducive to peace and stability. They're dressing up a political attack in bureaucratic clothing. And it's working. Because if you're an average Japanese citizen, you hear export controls, and you might think, okay, this is about trade. about competition. But it's not. It's about Taiwan. It's about sovereignty. It's about Japan's role in Asia. And it's about America's role too, whether we like it or not. The United States is the cornerstone of Japan's security. That's been true since the end of World War II. But Japan knows that America's attention is increasingly focused inward. They see our political divisions. They see the debates over foreign aid. They see the drift toward isolationism in certain parts of the American electorate. And now China is testing that alliance, quietly, deliberately. They're saying, we can mess with your key ally, Japan. We can make their defense sector stumble. We can raise their costs. And what are you going to do about it? The answer so far is nothing. I mean, we've had some statements from the State Department, a few expressions of concern, but no concrete action, no sanctions, no reciprocal controls, nothing that would make Beijing think twice. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. Maybe the U.S. shouldn't pick every fight. Maybe it's smarter to let Asia figure out its own security arrangements. But if that's the strategy, then Japan is on its own. And Japan knows that. So what happens next? I think there's a real possibility that this escalates further, that Japan imposes counter-sanctions, that the two countries get into a cycle of retaliation, tariffs, blacklists, asset freezes, that the regional supply chains get messier, more expensive, less reliable. And I think that's what China wants. Not total chaos, but enough disruption to make Japan think twice about how far they push on Taiwan. Let me step back for a moment and ask you a question. You're watching this video from wherever you are in the world. Maybe you're in the US, maybe you're in Europe, maybe you're in Asia yourself. What's your gut feeling about this? Because to me, this feels like a preview, a dress rehearsal for something bigger. If China is willing to do this to Japan, a major economy, a US ally, a country with a powerful defense force of its own, what would they do to Taiwan itself? What would they do to the Philippines, to Vietnam? They're building a playbook, and they're using Japan as the test case. And here's what really gets me. The reaction from the global business community has been muted. The stock markets barely flinched. The supply chain analysts are saying, this is manageable. They're saying companies will adapt. But that misses the point. The point isn't whether a few Japanese defense contractors can find new suppliers. The point is that a major power just openly used economic coercion to punish another country for its political stance. And nobody pushed back. Nobody said, this is unacceptable. Nobody said, you can't do that. And the next time, they'll do it again. And then again. And the boundaries will keep shifting until they don't exist anymore. I want to read you something. It's a line from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce statement. They said the move was aimed at safeguarding national security and fulfilling non-proliferation obligations. Now, if you read that fast, it sounds reasonable. Who doesn't want to safeguard national security? Who doesn't support non-proliferation? But think about what they're actually doing. They're saying Japan's defense research institutes, which study regional security, are somehow a proliferation threat. They're saying Mitsubishi's aviation subsidiaries are a proliferation threat. That's not about nuclear proliferation. That's not about weapons of mass destruction. That's about Japan being able to defend itself. And China wants to make that harder. It's a gaslight, honestly. It's a political move dressed in technical language. And the Western media is buying it. Let me bring this back to you, the viewer, one more time, because I think this matters to you, whether you realize it or not. The reason this matters to Americans is that Japan is our most important ally in Asia. The reason this matters to Europeans is that it sets a precedent for how China might treat your countries if you criticize them. The reason this matters to people in other parts of the world is that China is signaling that it will not tolerate dissent, and it will use its economic power to enforce that. This is a turning point, and I don't think we're talking about it enough. So let me ask you directly, are you worried about this? Does it scare you that China is moving this openly against a major U.S. ally? Or do you think Japan had it coming, that Takaichi walked into this by picking a fight she couldn't win? I'm curious, honestly. Drop a comment if you have a take, because I've been wrestling with this all day. The deeper concern here, and I want to end with this, is that we're entering an era where economic leverage replaces military confrontation as the primary tool of statecraft. That sounds less violent. It sounds less dangerous, but it might actually be more destabilizing, because economic war doesn't have clear boundaries. It doesn't have ceasefires. It doesn't have Geneva Conventions. It's just a slow grind. People losing jobs, companies going bankrupt, supply chains snapping, and no one's quite sure when to stop. China just turned the dial a little bit on Japan for now. But the dial is in their hands, and they're not afraid to turn it again. So we'll see what Japan does next. We'll see what the United States does. We'll see if Takaichi blinks or doubles down. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, the question that's sitting in my head and won't leave. If China can do this to Japan and nobody stops them, what's to stop them from doing it to anyone? That's the situation. That's what happened today. And I think we need to be paying way more attention than we are. Thanks for sitting with me through this. I know it's not the usual stuff. It's not the domestic drama. It's not the election chaos. But this matters. This is the kind of thing that shapes the world you're going to live in for the next 20 years. So keep your eyes on Asia. Keep your eyes on the supply chains, on the blacklists, on the quiet moves that don't make the front page, because that's where the real story is. I mean, that's where the real situation is. We'll be back with more soon. Take care of yourselves.